Welcome, listeners. I'm Mikhail Chester, and today I'm pleased to introduce Professor Adjo Amekudzi-Kennedy of Georgia Tech. When asked what infrastructure are supposed to do, responses, of course, vary dramatically from the mundane, for example, provide water and power, to the abstract, for example, facilitate improved well-being through the delivery of basic services. Of course, both of these are right on some level. But what is often lost is the perspective of the values that we use to design and operate infrastructure systems. In my talk with Adjo, she presents an argument to frame and refocus infrastructure with value-focused thinking. As we shift to ensure that infrastructure meet the needs of future populations in increasingly complex environments, Adjo makes the argument that value-focused thinking appears important for helping guide how we think about restructuring infrastructure. Here's my talk with Adjo. Enjoy. I am very happy to be talking to Professor Adjo Amekudzi-Kennedy at Georgia Tech, who has graciously agreed to talk to me about value-focused thinking, which is a concept, Adjo, that you have mentioned in passing many times in our conversation. So Adjo has been very involved with the UREX project, with the Growing Convergence Research Project. She's very plugged into sort of our research networks that have been going on around ASU and Georgia State and Atlanta and so on. So Adjo, welcome. And I was, in thinking about you, Adjo, over the past few days, I was thinking about the first time I met you, which was probably 12 years ago. I don't know if you remember this. This was at a
TRB.
It was at a CMU TRB dinner, kind of get together thing that has been organized every year forever, right? And I don't remember if I was at ASU or this was prior to ASU, but I remember sitting next to you and we shook hands. Hi, it seems crazy that we shook hands in this day and age, right? But hi, we introduced ourselves, and then I said to you something like, okay, what do you do? And you were a professor, obviously, at Georgia Tech at that point, and you said, okay, and the way you said it was fantastic. You said something like, okay, since you are this type of person who kind of gets me or has a similar background from like where I come from, I can give you this answer, which is different than the way I introduce myself to many other people. And that really resonated with me. Like I remember thinking, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? There's like this shadow description of yourself that you have that's different from the general public one. But Adjo, great to have you here, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I appreciate being here. I've been enjoying the conversations. I took away two concepts I've been thinking about from Cadmilla, talking about relationships, building trust relationships, and Mary talking about adaptive structure. Those two things I think have resonated with me, but I've been enjoying the conversations. Thank you very much for having me, and looking forward to our conversation.
Great, and I'm looking forward to talking to you. So let's jump in, Adjo. So where I like to start is kind of this question of, you've been at Georgia Tech for, I think you just said this, is it 20 years at this point?
Yes, this is my 21st year.
21st year, okay, congrats.
Thank you.
I don't know if there's any empirical data to back this up, but I feel like, academics move more frequently than they have in the past. That, this idea of staying put for longer is becoming less common. I could be totally wrong, but it feels that way. So you've been at Georgia Tech for 20 years, and maybe you can give us a little bit about your background, kind of where you came from. And I think particularly be interesting to hear, how you sort of came to be focused on, sustainable infrastructure, sustainability in general, as you sort of professionally developed.
Okay, very good. So I guess I'll start from, I was born and raised in Ghana, which is on the coast of West Africa. I did most of my schooling there. So I was about 17, and then I went to one of the United World Colleges to do my sixth form. United World Colleges are, these colleges that do rigorous international baccalaureate curriculum, but also really focused around the theme of peace and international understanding, fostering that co-curricular work. And there's a reason I bring this up, because before I left Ghana, I thought the world was a very big place. It just seemed tremendously big. After going to the UWC, and there were students from about 67 different countries, about 300 students. The world seems smaller. Okay, I realized that we were different because we had been brought up to think differently. We had different cultures and assumptions, etc. But at the core, we were very similar too. We're all looking for similar things. To do well in life. For our families, loved ones, etc., to do well, and so on and so forth. And in a certain sense, we shared similar values in that context. So maybe I'll be revisiting this. So I wanted to throw that there. Okay. From there, I came to the US. I did civil engineering as an undergraduate at Stanford. The way I came to do civil engineering really has to do with wanting to do STEM, but also wanting to do art. And I remember David Billington's work in I think it's the first civil engineering course I took on structural art. And the idea that you can have the most aesthetic designs be the most functional. And that was very fascinating to me. Anyway, so that's really what drew me into civil engineering. I did a master's in transportation engineering at Florida International University. And then I went on to Carnegie Mellon to do a PhD in infrastructure systems, civil engineering. So why did I go to grad school? I think you asked that, or maybe you didn't. But let me talk about it very briefly. I think there was a lot of mentorship there. So I want to also emphasize and advise them there. And then why did I end up in as an academic? I think a lot has to do with Sue McNeil and Adjo Amekudzi and others advising some of my parents' advice as well in that domain. But I ended up at Georgia Tech in 1999. And the school chair then said to me, "You are going to teach the sustainability course." And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I had been thinking about infrastructure systems, infrastructure management, but I really hadn't done anything with sustainability. And of course, I knew the definition in the dictionary. So I went to study the thing. I would study hours and hours. And then I went to, that's how I started with sustainability. And, I think your question is, how has my thinking evolved and my work evolved in this area? So I want to talk about that briefly, but I think you are asking me to condense 21 years into maybe, 10 minutes. So I'll talk about 5 things. Okay, I'll talk about sustainability planning and evaluation, which is where I started. And then I also want to talk a little bit about social equity and economic competitiveness, which is where I went next. And then very, very briefly about resilience, smart cities, and leadership and innovation, because that's really sort of, maybe not sequentially in a linear manner that way, but that's really generally how I've evolved over time in this work. And so, when I started at Georgia Tech, those days, my daughter would say the other century, 1999. Sustainability science, as we know it, I think was an emergent field. Okay, I mean, there were not so many calls for proposals in sustainability I knew of, or programs that were entitled sustainability, and so it was quite new. And I think that at that time, the issues were, how do you even define sustainability meaningfully? Okay, in different contexts, different communities. And how do you then plan for it and start to evaluate it in a meaningful manner? And I remember in the literature and also in conferences, etc., people would debate whether it's even a useful concept if you couldn't, or come up with a definition that everybody agrees on. So that's the kind of context we were operating. I think we've moved beyond that. But in that context, I started thinking about sustainability through the lens of asset management. because I was doing infrastructure asset management. But I moved it from just build systems asset management to think about it as a portfolio of assets. Okay, because the more I thought about it, the more I thought, if you think about any community at any scale, well, we can think about towns, cities, countries, whatever the scale, you can think that each of them has a portfolio of capital. Okay, and what do you mean? What do I mean by capital? Well, if the general definition of capital, a stock of accumulated goods and services that you can then leverage to create other goods and services of value and so on and so forth. But if we think about the forms of capital, we can think, communities have human capital, they have natural capital, economic, manufactured, right, intellectual, technology, built environment, cyber, and so cyber physical. I mean, we can have a long list. Some of these capital we can see with our eyes, some are invisible, but whether we see them or not, they are there. For example, institutions, okay? And all of them create value. They do create value. And so I started thinking in those terms, thinking about tangible, intangible assets. And through that lens, I could define sustainability and sustainable development from a portfolio capital assets perspective. So this became the sort of platform in which I started to think. And the general definition that I was operating with then is sort of the continuing development of human and other types of capital of interest to us, right? Within the constraints of all the other capital necessary for this continued development. So we could say to any entity, hey, listen, you have a portfolio of capital. You do what you want with it. Create the kinds of value you want with it, so long as you leave it in a state so that the next generation can come and do the same. So that is the intergenerational piece. But if you look at it intra-generationally, then you can say the same, you can make the same arguments and say, well, do it in a way where there is comparable value that you are creating, right, across different populations. So that became the lens through which I operated. And then we could think about strong and weak sustainability, which were concepts then, which simply said, listen, you cannot take naturally occurring capital and treat it the same way as you treat derived capital, which is man-made capital. Because guess what? You really cannot create the natural forms of capital that readily. So if you're going to use it in ways that sort of respect the rates of regeneration and so on and so forth. So with this kind of context, we could collect data then. We could define for local communities what their priorities were in terms of the different types of capital they had. We could collect data, okay, and maybe we couldn't collect all the data in all the different sectors, but at least conservatively, what we could see and what we could measure, we could collect. So we started, looking at data from a range of sources and collecting data on human capital, life expectancy, those kinds of, and then ecological footprint for the ecological piece, economic. So we collected that capital types of data and started doing capital accounting. Right, and at that time, the triple bottom line was emerging. Okay, so it's economy, environment, and society. But it doesn't have to be a triple bottom line. It can be a quadruple bottom line, if that's what a community, or a quintuple bottom line, right, and so on and so forth. So, but essentially, if we take a triple bottom line, and then out of that, we can start to, depending on how we scale it. If we take a nominal scale of high, medium, and low. We cut it in different places and are explicit about what we are doing, then some typologies start to fall out, right? You can have communities that have very well developed, maybe human capital, but they've done so at the expense of environmental capital, okay? Or some may have very strong triple bottom line capital. Others may have very weak on all fronts. So the whole concept of a sustainability threat or risk and a sustainability opportunity started to emerge, where you could look at entities and say, hey, you can see some static footprints, depending on what you're looking at. If you're looking at the triple bottom line, you can visualize it very nicely. And you can see frontiers of efficiency and effectiveness start to emerge, and that tells you something about the best practices at a particular time, statically. So you can learn from those best practices. And then you can also think about dynamic footprints, the rate of change of these capital over time, rate of change with respect to other capital, so capital efficiencies. And the capital efficiencies, perhaps we put more faith in than we should because of Jevon's paradox. They don't tell us too much, right, about sustainability. But essentially, we could do these kinds of things. And so I think that sort of rolled us on to feel we had, a domain that was more defensible in which we could operate. Okay. And so I kind of went along those lines. I worked with people like Jotin Kesti, Meleki Kayesi, and several students, etc. And we applied some of these concepts. We looked at sustainable footprint comparisons for different metro areas, different countries, etc. And in our minds, you could use these to start to generate portfolios of projects, right, to address the threats, leverage the strengths to address the threats, and evolve forward. So those are the kinds of things we're thinking about, the first several years. And then I got involved in the Integrated Network for Social Sustainability. Now that was an NSF sustainability research network. And I will tell you that my interactions with the folks in that research network challenged my views about social equity. Okay, I took some field trips in one of the INSS conference, and I understood that there are significant disparities, and we really have to treat social equity maybe in a little more depth than we are doing. So that's sort of moving me to another phase, which I want to talk about a little bit. And it's the whole idea of social equity and economic competitiveness. In the literature, at least the literature I've seen, that those two are not married too well, right? When you see social equity, it's talking about distribution of resources, but never talking about the advancement of the economy simultaneously. And I think when I look at many of the meetings I have been to, it's almost as if they are different groups that operate. Perhaps they are domains where both are talked about simultaneously. But some of the questions I started asking are, can social equity and economic competitiveness be advanced simultaneously? Because sometimes you talk to different folks, there's a certain sense, maybe it's not so explicit, sometimes explicit, that you do one at the expense of the other. Okay, sometimes. So that was one question. And then the other question was, well, do more equitable approaches, and I was doing this through the lens of transportation, come with lower rates of economic growth and vice versa. Okay, so I started working with some folks who work in institutions from the School of International Affairs, and we spent some time studying the transportation systems of 3 different countries. Okay, and their institutions over the past 50 to 70 years. And then we also looked at their transportation systems, and we looked explicitly at how they were addressing equity, the whole concept of equity. And at least three approaches, fell out of that. One was avoiding disproportionate distribution of benefits and burdens. Okay, the second one was creating economic growth and periodically correcting for the disparities. Okay, and the third one was largely application of an equitable decision-making process. So they were quite different. Okay, and then we collected data to really study the evolution of wealth creation in a broad sense and distribution over this time period. And so, I'm looking at some graphs here, and essentially these graphs are plotting GDP against Gini coefficient for those 3 different contexts. And they tell different stories, okay? And so in the places where there was intentionality, okay, about incorporating equity in the transportation system development. And transportation and infrastructure are really enablers. They are enablers of wealth. They help create wealth, access, to basic goods and services, to jobs, to healthcare, and so on and so forth. So then in that same token, where they are less available, you can see also they retard the development of wealth in a certain sense, in a broad sense. And so, we see that in places where, with this first small study, and the paper is actually under review, it hasn't been published yet, that we see that where there is an intent to create social equity and advance economic competitiveness, when you look at the data, that's what's happening, right? The Gini coefficient is going down, GDP is going up. Where there is no definite intent, you don't see it in the data, right? And it's almost like that, what do you expect? Of course, if you look at inputs and processes, and you have some intent around those inputs and processes, you expect to see them in outputs and outcomes, right? But it was also a revelation in a certain sense, because what it said was that, yes, number one, yes, you can't create both simultaneously, intentionally, and one doesn't necessarily have to come at the expense of the other. And I think on a very sort of intuitive level, if you think about even families, let's take families as an example, and arguably they are different cases, but hardly does anyone who can afford it have 3 children or 4 children or 2 and say, hey, listen, I'm going to educate these 2 a little better than these intentionally. People don't do that, right? Because you know that by educating them all, you are creating wealth and you are creating resilience, fiscal resilience for the family at large, and so on and so forth. So certainly one of the things we recognize out of that work is that you can do both, and one doesn't necessarily have to come at the expense of the other. But actually what happens is if you can really create both simultaneously, then you also create resilience for the region or the community, okay? So, and then very interestingly, we could also see some relationships between the different types of capital, right? So we looked at institutions. So we mapped those institutions to the built environment capital that came up, because institutions do shape built environment capital, right? And then built environment capital, transportation, energy, water, housing, etc., also enable socioeconomic capital. If you invest, right, in those, then you see the outputs and outcomes as well. But the thing that was missing wasn't that we couldn't see, well, you can't see institutions, certainly, they are invisible. And maybe you can't see socioeconomic capital per se, you see evidences of it. But they are all assets nonetheless. But the thing that was driving all of them, you could extract, was values, right? If you said there are going to be some values and decision maker values and intentionality around creating social equity, then you would see it in the institutions very explicitly, because there's intentionality. And then when you go to the built environment, you would see that if you look for it, if you just didn't look at it, infrastructure as a physical, but you looked at it holistically and also across time, then you would see those values propagated. And likewise, you would see those values in the socioeconomic realm. And so the whole idea of values, very important. They are invisible, but very, very important assets. Okay, so I think this is what this sort of thinking has brought us to. We are thinking more about it there, and simultaneously, the other things we are thinking about now, resilience. Certainly, we have to think about resilience when we think about sustainability, because resilience has now become a threat, right? A threat to sustainability. And if you look at the ASCE, the 5 criteria that ASCE envisioned tool, which is a sustainability rating tool, but I think it's a planning tool, as the triple bottom line are there. quality of life, economic capital is called resource allocation, natural world relates to environment, then they have climate and risk. So that's there. And then they have leadership. And I think leadership is also critical because it really tells us that maybe we are going on paths that have been unbeaten. They are unprecedented scenarios we are going to face, and we are going to have to innovate our ways through them. And then finally, the other thing, we started thinking about is the concept of smart, as in smart cities, smart infrastructure, etc. And the idea there is that, when we look at least if you look at some of the literature on smart, you see that the smart tends or seems to apply more to technologies or the physical or non-human element of the system than the human element of the system. And I think that is maybe an opportunity for us to refine the definitions of smart. Because if we are talking about systems that have humans and non-humans, and the adjective smart relates to the non-human part of the system, I think we are in for some surprises in terms of what we expect the systems to do. And we can look at some historical examples and you'll see that. And so, whenever I talk about this, I think of an example somebody gave me from Dubai. I've never been to Dubai, but someone told me when they visited Dubai and they wanted to take a trip, they could plan out the trip in real time with multiple modes, sit there and plan, and then get real-time information on what their carbon footprint is, how long it's going to take, and how much it's going to. So in other words, a range of indicators of importance to them. So if we start to think in value-focused ways, then can we build systems so that they give us information on the things we care about in real time and allow us to interact with the system as we make decisions to enhance, I'm not going to use the word optimize intentionally here, but to enhance those values in the system, individually and collectively. To me, that would be a more smart system. Yeah, so I think these are some of the things that we have been thinking about.
Adjo, that's awesome. Thanks for the overview. Years ago, I was involved with a company that was developing an augmented reality app. This was probably 10 years ago. So it was the early stages of augmented reality, where you could hold up your phone in, let's say, a marketplace, a grocery store, anything like that, and it would recognize the products and give you the carbon footprint of the product, right?
Wow.
And I think that app is still around. I think it's been significantly developed from where I helped them get it going. So Adjo, you mentioned a lot of things. So lots of my wheels are spinning. But one of the things I now recognize, or I'm starting to make some connections on, given your background, is the sort of capital approach. So you sort of thinking about capital as sort of like these building blocks of a society, right? In various unitless forms or something like that, right? Maybe they have units, some do, some don't, something like that. But that seems to come from your expertise in asset management. Is that reasonable to say? Right?
I think that's very, very reasonable to say, because I think that was my baseline for thinking about sustainability when there were not too many frameworks to operate with, right? And so I was intentional about wanting to find a framework that is defensible, that can help me explain some of these things. And it came from there definitely did. In fact, when I started out as an assistant professor, I said I want to study portfolio theory. And portfolio theory is an old theory. I mean, to some extent, I think aspects of it are maybe outdated. But it's focused on fiscal capital, money, financial capital. But there were many things about it that intuitively I felt could translate to thinking about capital holistically, right? But I think that certainly came from my background in infrastructure asset management.
Yeah, so one other comment that you mentioned, so smart associated with technology. I mean, I would generally agree with you. I think that's the way that it has gotten off the ground. We generally associate smart with physical things like hardware and software. I tend to think about SMART as a set of processes that improve cognition. And I think you were kind of getting at this in what you were saying. Cognition for people, but I think also increasingly for software. And I think that you can sort of think of that sort of SMART capability as being one enabled by physical technologies like sensors, that we now have accelerometers on our body that we didn't have before, right, in cell phones. You have software that is making sense of things, without human intervention. And then you have people, obviously, that are not only receiving the data, but are also interacting with those systems. And to me, the ultimate goal of SMART is cognition. When I was talking to Thad on Monday, right, this notion that, a lot of times when it came to infrastructure, I think that there was this sort of acceptance a long time ago that infrastructure civil infrastructure in particular, have a lot of technology in them, and that is the domain of engineers. So infrastructure is about technology, it's about engineering, right? When it's about everything under the sun, right? I mean, every discipline you can imagine probably has something to say or has some stake in infrastructure.
Yeah, and I really should add, it's not only that they have some stake. It's interesting. Usually, if you're working with folks in other disciplines, I have found, in my experience, they may, and you hear a question asked about infrastructure, they will give an answer unless maybe it's intentionally supposed to be interdisciplinary, but they think the answer is either institutional or economic. That's whichever discipline they are grounded in, that's where they think the answer is. So I think in general that's really my experience working with folks. And sometimes I jokingly say, if you ask an engineer, they will tell you it's an engineering, the solution is an engineering one. But the point is that it's all of the above, right? Yeah.
But I wonder with SMART if we have sort of started off that space of study, in the past 10 years, whatever you want to call it, that field, largely associating it with the domain of technologists, so computer scientists, electrical engineers, that sort of thing, where of course it has implications society-wide across all domains. So maybe we should all decide SMART is the domain of the sociologists or something like that, right? It would have a very different interpretation if we did that.
Yeah, but I think of maybe we can even just look at how societies and humans have interacted with the transportation system, and induced demand and human behavior not always necessarily being what we assume it would be. And so I think, yes, maybe we can say we bring it to the sociologists, but I think it should be for everyone that if we build infrastructure systems and we know humans are going to interact with it, I think we've gotten to the point where we can start to think in more structured and systemic terms and about this interaction, and also factor it into the modeling and thinking we do. Because we've learned from the past that not doing that does not help us get closer to the intended outcomes.
So Adjo, you mentioned you sort of framed value-focused concepts or value-focused thinking with us. So I want to kind of pivot now to infrastructure and ask you, how do we apply value-focused thinking to infrastructure? What does that mean? But not just infrastructure, right? Infrastructure and community development or communities in general.
Yes. So I learned about value-focused thinking, I want to say maybe a little over 10 years ago. From Ralph Keeney. He wrote the book Value-Focused Thinking. Okay, and excuse me, and I served with Ralph Keeney on the board on infrastructure and the constructed environment, the National Research Council for several years. And essentially the way he talks about it is making the values in any decision context explicit. Okay, making them explicit, and then using that information to frame your objectives explicitly, to create decision opportunities. Okay, if there are no decision problems, sometimes there are decision problems. That's why you are making the decision in the first place. You come across a problem and you say, okay, we need to decide what to do, and then you generate alternatives. But if there's a decision problem, that's fine. If not, if you want to create a decision opportunity, which distinguishes from a decision problem, there is no clear problem staring us in the face. But given the values we have and want to promulgate, we can create a decision opportunity, okay, and use those values within that decision opportunity. And so he says, if you do that, then and before you start to create alternatives, then you are likely to create alternatives that either solve that problem that's existing while advancing the other values in your value portfolio, so to speak, right? And if you operate in that way, then you are constantly going to be, advancing your value. So the opportunity cost of missing some values just because you happened upon a problem and didn't think of a lesson. So it seems to me we can use that kind of thinking across the board, life cycle of infrastructure decision making, visioning, planning, value-focused planning, value-focused design. Of course, and when we come to performance monitoring, we must make sure that we are capturing it also. So we are always bringing the values to the forefront. It's not that they don't exist. Sometimes they are hidden in the function. And if we bring them to the forefront, then I think even the way we evaluate, the evaluation function will have to have value measures that reflect, the breadth of our value. So I think that's how it can be applied. Okay, I think it's an intentional kind of approach where you make the values explicit in decision making, and then you carry through with it, and it's a constant thing. And you are not only waiting for problems to show up before you start to engage in that kind of decision, moving forward with decisions. You can just create decision opportunities with saying, hey, we want to advance this value. There's no clear problem staring us in the face. So I think this is how it can be applied.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So the, so we've talked about this concept a few times, like over the past few days, that civil engineers, or maybe engineers at large, have these toolkits, right? And these toolkits largely come from the university training or on the job training, and these tools probably emphasize a particular set of goals and priorities, right? There's an implicitness to them, and there's probably a lot there, right? But they probably emphasize certain sets of goals that may not, right, we could say, be in line with things like equity, for example. When you are advocating, like, this idea that, you have to start by making your values explicit, I like that a lot, right? Because I wonder if, civil engineers or engineers at large start with these tools, right? And these tools probably do have values that are associated with them, but they may not be the values that we want to be emphasizing today, something along those lines. Does that sound right?
Yes, I would say that, and I would also say that if we think about this further, then, and we look at different communities, maybe the values we want to emphasize, we may not emphasize all the values in the same way for every community. Does that make sense? It depends. It depends. So if we have homogeneous communities, then maybe it doesn't matter too much. But if we agree that we have non-homogeneous communities, and in some cases they are underserved communities, that are more vulnerable in certain ways because of the way infrastructure investments have occurred in the past, and so on and so forth, then yes, that's exactly the point, that we need to be very clear about what the values are, which ones we are elevating and applying for different contexts in time and space. Okay, if we all agree that certain values are important, so that if we say, for example, everybody must have comparable standards of mobility and access. That's a value. Okay, and if you give me any community, I can spend a little bit of time and tell you, do they have comparable, right? We could do that. That's something that's objective. We can do that. So if we say, well, maybe we are looking at some context and we say, well, no, we don't see that, then we can say, well, we need to elevate this value. And so that is going to be propagated in the evaluation tools we use, right? It should be part of the factor in there, and so on and so forth, the vision, in addition, the objectives, etc. And then we move things forward in that way.
Adjo, I wonder, can I play the devil's advocate for a minute? You know, in this day and age of ideological polarization, right? Somebody might say, well, I don't think that everybody should have the same rights or access to mobility. I think, right, access to mobility must be earned, right? And it's okay if some people don't have it, they just need to earn it. You know, is there a like common set of values, you know, that we could even, you know, start to sort of, you know, overlay on our decision-making processes?
Yes, so I will answer that question in 2 ways. The first one is, I'll just say, what's the definition of public, right? Because we talk about public infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And if you look in the dictionary, look for the definition of public, it says of or concerning people as a whole. So I think if we are talking about public infrastructure, then certainly we can say that, I mean, some may go as far as to argue you have to have equal mobility. I don't know how you measure that. So I don't talk in those terms, but I say you need to have comparable access, levels of access, comparable levels of mobility over time, right? Does that make sense? Because guess what? These comparable, levels of access, levels of mobility, and so on and so forth for all the other infrastructure, they translate into wealth creation. I mean, you can do the influence diagrams. It generates socio-economic capital. So if I look at one community that has limited and has had limited access to mobility for a very long time, certainly, if you look at it's difficult to demonstrate causation, but correlation, you see the correlation there when you look at socio-economic measures. So that's the first answer I'll give. I'll say, let's look at what does public infrastructure mean? And I think that the point we should make is we can advance mobility and access for all while advancing economic competitiveness. It actually comes as a matter of fact. They are not separate. You know, we don't stop to advance mobility and access for this community at the expense of, no, it doesn't, it all comes, because once you do that, you are also advancing, you know, socio-economic capital. Then the second one, I guess, because we are civil and environmental engineers, I would say let's go to the ASC Code of Ethics, right? And if you have been looking at the ASC Code of Ethics, I think in the past few years, it's certainly not, there is now an A canon on social equity. So I'll say it is really the ethical thing to do according to the profession at this time. Okay, but I think it's not just that it's equitable. You can really, if you want to do a study, you can do a study to see what are the impacts of advancing social equity on economic competitiveness, right? On social quality of life, and so on and so forth. The same way you can do it for families. You see that the outcomes are, I mean, you want thriving communities, places you like to be, are not scared, etc. You want to advance these things. And so those to me are the answers.
You know, there's, I mean, I think that there is, I mean, I appreciate those answers. I mean, there's, I would argue a challenge that we face as infrastructure professionals in how people at this point sort of interpret the purpose of infrastructure systems within the context of serving the public. I mean, I think that perspective in many ways has been lost. You know, I think that there's, again, this narrative that, you know, maybe it's been there forever, I don't know, that, you know, we can privatize infrastructure and it'll operate more effectively, but I think we've just lost the ability in many ways to communicate how infrastructure about serving public value not about creating market value. And there's many implications to framing it on along those dimensions, right? One of which is this discussion that I've had with so many people on transportation in particular, right? Where transportation has a derived demand. Transportation doesn't make money. You can count on one or two hands the number of public transit systems in the world that make money, that are profitable. Your car doesn't make money, right? The value is what you get at the end of the trip, so to speak, not of the actual transportation itself. When it comes to water, in the United States, right, we don't pay for water. We don't pay for molecules of water. We pay for the conveyance of the water, the treatment of the water, right? We have these sort of complicated rights management schemes that say, so many billions of gallons of water are allocated to one place versus another. They're sort of just given away, whereas the actual molecules of water themselves are not something we pay for like we might with wood or fuel or something else. So I think there's a really good opportunity to rethink how we communicate what infrastructure is about, that is not part of the common discourse anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, so, and I agree with you, but I'm thinking about these things you're saying. I think certainly if you think about transportation in the context of a market, so perhaps we are thinking about alternative delivery systems, right? This is what you're thinking about. We turn something, a system over to be built, operated, and transferred, etc. Even if we do, when that happens, you notice that the public sector maintains the standards, right? Because it's public infrastructure. Yeah. So and I struggle with the concept transportation doesn't make money, because I go back to the 50s, before we had the interstate highway system, and I look at people trying to cross from New York, right, to San Francisco, and you saw how long it took them to cross. And then you look today at transportation, it creates money. It just, we haven't figured out how to measure it. I think it does. I think if you look at it in a full scope, and of course, some of the value or the benefits are intangible. But there's this saying that I like, that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. I think it applies. I think it's been attributed to Albert Einstein or somebody, but in that, I think if you look at the world pre some of these major infrastructure systems that we take for granted today, or maybe not so much for granted, but they are part of the whole fixtures that we see. If you look at before and after, you can certainly say that the economic and quality of life impacts have been tremendous. And if you did a benefit cost analysis and did it well, I believe you will say it generates a whole lot, money included.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you when you look across, all of society, right? What it enables, certainly the value is there, but the activity itself, right, is a means to an end.
Yes, I agree. I agree fully.
So Adjo, you've mentioned education multiple times. I know you are passionate about education and innovating in education. Where do you think we are in terms of education today as it comes to infrastructure, and where do you think it is that we need to go?
Yes, right. So maybe I'll start with what are some of the biggest challenges we have with infrastructure today, maybe, and then I can talk a bit about education. So I think, of course, depending on who you ask, you get different answers. I'll give you 5. I think learning from the past is one of the challenges we have. I think we need, I don't know, maybe it was Shoshana Sachs who said we are ahistorical in the first talk that you had with Pat. And I think that's true. I think maybe to some extent, and all of it, I think I should learn more about the history of of infrastructure development. Why? Because I think infrastructure, if we do that, we learn the lessons that allow us to negotiate the current challenges we have, while also understanding how far we've come. I mean, I was just reading the book that you and Sybil Derable have just put out, Urban Infrastructure Reflections for 2100. And I'm looking at Joel Tarr's piece in there, and he talks about, you know, how infrastructure has evolved in the 19th and 20th centuries. That sort of temporal depth, I think if you have it, you approach the current problems differently, and perhaps also think about the future differently. Okay, so I mean, we are looking at climate change. It looks like we have an existential threat currently. I think one of the questions to ask is, there were many disruptions and significant challenges in the past as infrastructure evolved. How were they addressed, right? What were the lessons learned that can be applied to today? And if we think our challenges are very significant today, do we think 100 years from now, right? And I don't know if you've dropped off, Mike. Do we think 100 years from now, oh, there you are, you know, in 20 or whatever, let's say 2135, the year 2135, people will look back at the challenges we have today, if we are still here, as you would say, and say, oh man, these guys had such major unsurmountable challenges. I don't know that that's what they will say, because I'm here sitting here in 2020 in the comfort of my home with my heat, and I have access to a nice interstate where I can do different things. I think when the folks were thinking about building that interstate, it was a major challenge to them, right? So I think that's sort of, that my point is that temporal depth, it is missing and it's necessary, okay? And then of course, we've talked about changing the way we think about infrastructure. I think we can't think about it only as physical anymore. We have to think about it as cyber physical. We have to think about it as, you know, institutional, physical. I mean, it's just quite a big thing. It's a mechanism, so some organism that has all these capital elements. And I think if those who really realize that and take advantage of that will have a competitive advantage. So I think that should find its way into education. Of course, we have to think about how to adapt to climate change, but as simultaneously how to mitigate, right? If you look at transportation, I think transportation, the US EPA has said that 28% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the past year have been from transportation, and perhaps the most significant. I don't know where I have, you know, more, when I hear about resilience and adaptation for transportation, it is more, you know, or transportation resilience, it has been leaning, it appears more toward adaptation. But here's a huge opportunity for mitigation, which really is going to, you know, hit resilience in a more substantive way. So there's a huge opportunity cost if we are not doing both. So I think that has to find its way. You know, we talked about putting the human in smart, and you know, so these are some of the things I think that we have to be thinking about. I think engineers have to become more comfortable in normative spaces. What do I mean? That they should be able to articulate the values underlying the decisions they are making, look at trade-offs, negotiate pathways that they think are more beneficial. You know, I don't think engineering has to be a-normative, right? I think we've passed the stage where we can afford to do that. And so it's good to see that the ethical codes are also evolving, you know, accordingly. And certainly, I think that we should be able to achieve equitable infrastructure, because it is really a foundation for many things. And if infrastructure is public, then certainly we want public infrastructure to give comparable access over time.
Adjo, there's a great question that has popped up from Matt, which we'll come to in a little bit here on the concept of education and transforming education. So we'll come back to that. Yeah, I mean, Adjo, you said a number of things, but you know, let me that I could respond to. But let me since we're at the hour, there's a couple more questions I want to get to with you. So let me just jump to those. So, while we're at it, what does the civil engineer of the future look like? I think it's interesting to think. I mean, given the perspective that you have, talking about 20 years ago, introducing some sustainability to Georgia Tech CE, but also, what you just said, the importance of understanding history, right, in where we go in the future, and I will point out to the conversation yesterday with Mary, where she was outlining some of the characteristics of a complex versus complex system, and one of those characteristics is complex versus complicated system. One of those characteristics is components have history. There is history to some of the subsystems and parts of the system that, if acknowledged or if not understood, can create lots of interesting dynamics that, make the system do things that you don't expect. And I think that's very much the case with us. So where do we go from here? Like, are we as a discipline, civil engineers and on the right track? Are we moving fast enough? But also I want to recognize that, there's lots of non-civil engineers, non-engineers, right? And you know a lot of them on the talk today. So, I often say infrastructure professionals more broadly. And I think, that space, like, are we on the right track? What should we be doing differently?
Okay. Well, let me start with I'll start with the vision that the American Society of Civil Engineers had, then I'll expand it. Okay, so they put out early 2000s, they put out a vision for civil engineering in 2025. It has about five major areas. The first one, they said civil engineers. Well, they said civil engineers are trusted by society to create a sustainable world. So that's nice to see that there, and enhance the global quality of life. Okay. Then, so they talk about engineers being planners, master planners, designers, constructors, operators of society's economic and social engine. That is standard, you know that. But then they also talk about master stewards of the natural environment. And then the third, they talk about master innovators and integrators. And what do they mean by that? Of ideas and technology across public, private, and academic sectors. When I think of you, Mike, sometimes I think of you as an integrator, because some of the things you were doing, even in this speaker series, I think, bringing Mary Albion from where she is and integrating her thinking, etc. So I think, yes, we have to do more of that. And then the fourth one, we talk about master managers of risk and uncertainty caused by natural events, accidents, other threats, right? So that's absolutely essential. And then, of course, they talk also about leaders in discussions and decisions shaping public and environmental infrastructure policy. I think we need to do all of the above in tandem with other infrastructure professionals. Okay, and there are a couple of documents I want to reference very briefly. The first one is a report from the 2019 ASC Education Summit. So that just came out last year, and it talked about four things that need to be done in civil engineering education. The first one is that it said we need to re-examine and potentially redefine the domain of civil engineering, learn to include new competencies related to emerging technologies. I think this is true for all professionals. More systems thinking, right? They talk about the culture of innovation. I think this is true for all engineering professionals. More directed teaching of creative processes, right? And then also curricular flexibility. And I'm thinking, because we are going to continue to have to innovate. And so that's the first point about changing the nature of civil engineering. The second point they make is that we have to elevate professional skills to truly equal footing with technical skills, right? And they talk about things like communication, teamwork, leadership, lifelong learning, ethical responsibilities, and so on and so forth. And then third, they talk about, and this is exactly what it is, develop a diverse, inclusive, equitable, and engaging culture within the profession. And really that has got to do in part with the types of problems we are solving today, just as they don't fit neatly within any disciplinary bucket, they also cut across, if you're talking about intellectual diversity and so on. So that just gives us strength. And that reminds me of the collective leadership framing that Mary was using yesterday. And the fourth, they simply say that we should hold more national and international meetings and dedicate resources to address the finding. To me, this is the innovation piece, because they recognize that things are going to be changing. Okay, if you look at the environmental engineering, a report that came out of the National Academy of Engineering last year, same thing on environmental engineering for the 21st century, you see it says similar things, right? These are the kinds of challenges it identifies. It says sustainably supply food, water, and energy, curb climate change to adapt its impacts, design a future without pollution or waste, create efficient, healthy, resilient cities, and then foster informed decisions and actions. And three ways, it says we need to expand the scope of environmental engineering, move from focusing on individual problems to systems-based solutions that address a broad sets of issues. It talks about proactivity, not reactivity, right? Environmental engineers need to anticipate problems rather than react to them. I think that's one of the things we need to understand problem formation. That has got to do with understanding what has happened prior, right? Because if we are only solving problems, then we are never leading. We just behind it, the problem, we try to solve it, we go. So no, we should be able to look ahead and say, hey, look, this is what has been happening. That's why we have the issues we have with climate change today. What can we do differently in the future, right? And then they talk about diversity and collaboration, similar to the civil engineering report. So I think all these are very good. I would add also that we need, and if you look at the engineering for sustainable development, this is from the UN. They are cross-cutting competencies for land. So the competencies one needs to implement those sustainable development goals. They talk about these things: systems thinking, anticipatory, strategic collaboration, critical thinking, and then self-awareness that's reflective, sort of metacognitive. They talk about integrated problem solving. But one of the things they talk about, which I think is normative, reflect on norms and values, negotiate values and trade-offs. So it goes back to this whole value focus kind of approach. Be explicit about those. I think we can't afford anymore to say, hey, no, I'm objective, so I don't talk about values. But values are embedded. They are just not explicit, right? So, and we have used those embedded values to do many great things, but they've also brought us to some challenging positions. So let's make them explicit and let's contribute to that debate, because to me, that's how we also get on the table to lead. Otherwise, we'll just be following and solving one problem after another. We'll never really get to the front of it.
Adjo, I love this. I love the idea of making values explicit, because there's a parallel that I have heard some folks say, and I think Mary was saying this yesterday, that we should also ask the question, for example, or the parallel question of how do we make decisions? How do we lead? I mean, what sort of implicit set of rules or norms have we subscribed to, right? Implicit in our processes and in our actions and the way we fund things, so on and so forth, and the technologies that we use that, essentially what we were talking about on Monday with that create lock-in, right? Just sort of create this sort of long-term cycle, right? One of the issues is that, as many of us talk about, infrastructure generally have very long lifetimes. So, there's a potential for really big impact when we lock in a set of values that are sort of inappropriate for the future, or work now but may not work in the future, right? Because we're stuck with them. And as we often have seen as of late, even if we want to get rid of that infrastructure today, there's a backlog, there's no funding, there's an immense set of challenges to make that happen. Adjo, you were talking about ASCE a lot, and I want to second kind of what you were saying and make sure that the audience knows that ASCE is remarkably progressive in sort of how they are thinking about what infrastructure should do. I think a lot of the points you're making, Adjo, resonate very well with kind of what ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineers, have advocated. And there's a challenge that ASCE faces, and this is not picking on ASCE in any way. It's just recognizing that it is a professional society, and it makes recommendations.
Yeah.
In order for those recommendations to become action, we need practitioners, we need academics to sort of advocate for it, to embed it in code, in law, in practice, and so on. And that sort of scale jump, or governance jump, is one of the challenges that the organization faces, and that's why I think it's so important for us to sort of get behind often a lot of the really great things that organization is doing. The other we may have talked about this, Adjo, but one of the challenges I also think that our profession, that infrastructure face is, again, if we all agree that infrastructure are made up of just so many different disciplines, right? But there is a really big power differential that is weighted towards civil engineers in particular, by the sheer fact, I would argue, and I think this is accurate, right? Somebody should run the numbers one of these days, that for every one ecologist that is doing something related to infrastructure, there's probably 1,000 engineers, right, that are doing something related to infrastructure. And maybe that's just sort of a natural fallout of or maybe a preferential fallout of the ways that we have said infrastructure operate in particular ways, or technology focused, therefore we need armies of engineers to do it, something along those lines. So I think that there's this sort of power dynamic that's important to recognize, that we are also I don't want to say working against, but need to work within, right? And I think a lot of kind of what you are saying has to do with how we change the thinking, the approaches that this army of, for example, civil engineers are bringing to the table when they approach infrastructure.
Yes, yes, I see exactly what you are saying. And maybe I agree with 95% of what you are saying. Maybe in numbers, we have more civil engineers, but I don't know. I mean, in terms of who makes decisions for funds to be allocated, do you think it's the civil engineers who are controlling? I think that capital, financial capital, is very strong. So, right. So I think, in fact, that brings me to a point that I have been thinking, the way, maybe there's something like an engineer corps that could be created, where engineers can also serve, in political or policy decision-making positions at some point in their career. Engineers could choose to do that, to help with making some of the big decisions on where infrastructure is invested. And I think, and of course, others as well. So I think this is really, and I like it that you talk about infrastructure professionals. I think it has to be an interdisciplinary effort, absolutely. Of course, made a little more challenging by the fact that we can't abandon the disciplinary efforts at the same time, because strong disciplinarity is what enriches interdisciplinary thinking and action. So it has to be all of the above, I think.
So Adjo, one more question for you. So in the context of value-focused thinking, do you envision that there could be such a thing as a value-focused engineer or value-focused engineering, and sort of how would that be different than what we have today?
Yes, absolutely. I think so. I think there is such a thing as a value-focused engineer. It's an engineer who recognizes that values underlie all decisions that are made, all institutions, the built environment that emerges from them, and the wealth and quality of life that generates. That's that type of engineer. Understands these things, and so understands that the tools that we are using, you can't just take them at face value and look at them as black boxes. You have to question what are the underlying values. And it may be that we need to retool, we need to modify some of the tools when we are actively want to promote certain kinds of values in different contexts. I think that's a value focused engineer. It's one that is not afraid of normative thinking, understands that there are norms that underlie all these tools, and the fact that you don't talk about them does not necessarily make the tools objective. The tools can be objective if you are explicit about the values. And I think such a value-focused engineer is also one who understands the past and how it influences the future.
Thanks, Adjo. So I want to talk more about education, or hear more about education from you. And I think we have a question on that. So I'll sort of table those questions there, or my thoughts there. But one last question, and you may have already answered this, but I've been asking this to the other panelists, the other speakers. What is there a book or a particular resource that you would recommend to the audience?
Okay. Can I recommend more than one, or is only one?
You can have more than one. I think that's reasonable.
Okay, certainly Value-Focused Thinking by Ralph Keeney, A Path to Creative Decision Making. That's what's called, Harvard University Press, 1992. I think that's a great book. Some books are transformative. When you read them, you can think of before and after. To me, that has been one of those books that has been transformative for me. And then I would also recommend Mega Communities. I just finished reading that book, How Leaders of Government, Business, and Nonprofits Can Tackle Today's Global Challenges Together. It's by Gerin, Gerin, and CSER, and others. And they're actually from Booz Allen and Hamilton. It's a private sector, but they wrote this. And it really is talking about, I think you talked with Thad about some of the things he's talking about how you bring together just different sectors to tackle these wicked problems we have today, right? In this book, they didn't include the academic sector as an entity in its own. They looked at private, civic, the private sector, the civic sector, government, and so on and so forth. But they didn't. I think we can include academics because they can bring something unique in there. But I think the model is going to be extremely useful as we go forward. And of course, I think people should also read Urban Infrastructure Reflections, 2100, which I am reading. I have read about 6 reflections, and I think I'm richer for it.
Thanks for the plug, Adjo, and thanks for those other recommendations. There are many people on the call with us today who contributed to that book, so I feel like it's reasonable to mention it. The book that Adjo mentioned that Sybil Darable and I put together was meant to provide a platform where infrastructure folks, not just engineers, could provide visions for 2100 or a long time from now to sort of think about where, help us think about as a community where we should potentially point the ship. So Adjo, there's no more questions. So any final thoughts, comments, reactions from you? I want to kind of leave the last comment in your hands.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to have this discussion. I would really like this discussion to see it continue and everybody being able to participate, because I'm very curious to hear what some of the folks on this call also think about some questions that have been raised. Final thoughts. I think, if we take a historical look at infrastructure, it has come a long way. So I think we really need to acknowledge that we have come a very long way. At the same time, we've done things in some ways that have also resulted in unintended consequences. So I think we have a nice opportunity here, as there has been at various junctures, in the continuum, to really take a holistic look back, okay, in order to be able to move forward with lessons learned and look systemically at what we are doing, start to think about values, making them more explicit. And I know you and I, Mike, we've had conversations about complexity today. I see you didn't talk too much about complexity, but I think, yeah, we may say that there's a lot of complexity in what's going on, but the same way we may look at nature, and nature is quite complex, but the outcomes, the values, I think we can see are quite simple. Okay, when I wake up, the sun is going to rise, then I'll get some sunshine, or what if I'm not in, they are just quite simple. If you look at what is the intent, what does nature, so yes, I think maybe the means to the ends could be complex, but maybe the values we are all looking for are not so different. That's what I think. And I think we have a very fine opportunity with the challenges we face to revisit that holistically, okay, and start to drive our infrastructure in directions that we want to go, because we are going to be having disruptions we don't like. And also disruptions, positive, potentially positive ones, automation, connectivity, etc. Lots of things are coming at us. If we have our values very explicit and clear, then we can take them and be creative and put them in a sort of an arrangement that we want to have, and drive our infrastructure in those directions, rather than be buffeted by things, because they are going to come from all directions, right? But if our values dominate, then I think we have a stronger platform with which to move forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adjo. Appreciate your time and your thoughts on the topic.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Have a good day, all.